It was just an ordinary envelope, no return address, no handwriting, only 4 delicate flower petals pressed inside. But when the bride-to-be opened it, her smile vanished, because MissMarple had once seen such a message before, and it had ended in murder. The village of Little Witchford slumbered beneath a veil of April mist, its thatched rooftops softened by dew and memory. There was a stillness in the air, the sort that encouraged quiet voices and gentle steps on graveled lanes. Into this hush arrived MissMarple, her coat buttoned neatly to the collar, a modest valise in hand. Her cousin Mildred's cottage, whitewashed and vine-covered, stood just beyond the churchyard and received her like a memory reawakened. The fire had been lit in the sitting room, and tea was already poured. A single bud of narcissus drooped in a small china vase. MissMarple settled in with polite warmth, observing the faded chintz curtains, the slightly misaligned mantel clock, and the way the milk was a touch overboiled. Charming, if imperfect, reminders that life in the village retained its rhythm. But even in that peace, she felt it, a slight tension in the air, as though the season held its breath. Later that morning, word arrived via Mildred's cheerful postmistress that Edith Calthorpe had received something peculiar in the day's letters. MissMarple, intrigued by the rarity of true mystery in so sedate a place, accompanied her cousin to the vicarage under the guise of neighborly kindness. Edith, always composed, always correct in manner, appeared unusually rattled. She showed them the item in question, a cream-colored envelope, thick and fibrous, with no return address and an unfamiliar postmark. Camberwell, perhaps, though smudged. Inside were 4 rose petals, dried and crumbling slightly at the edges. Their red hue had deepened with time, but remained vivid. There was no note. The vicar, Reverend Calthorpe, dismissed it gently. A curious little prank, perhaps. But Edith was pale. She set the petals on a saucer and stared at them, as though searching for something hidden in their silent fall. MissMarple said very little. She simply looked, and noted, and let her thoughts settle into place with the quiet certainty of one who knew too well that flowers, once pressed, could carry more than beauty. That afternoon, MissMarple examined the envelope once more in solitude, seated near Mildred's parlor window, where the lace curtains filtered soft morning light. The weight of the paper, the brittleness of the petals, the absence of words, all of it spoke more clearly than any message could. There was something disturbingly reminiscent in the gesture. She had seen such things during the war years, when grief turned to symbols, and symbols to quiet vengeance. She remembered a nurse in Hampshire who'd once received a folded leaf from a sycamore tree, the meaning of which had only become clear after a court-martial. That had involved betrayal, too. Domestic in nature, but no less potent. The red rose was a familiar flower, but there was something disconcerting in its division into 4 parts. A whole rose would have been sentimental, a single petal romantic, but 4, chosen and pressed, suggested deliberation, a reckoning. She thought of Edith then, how the woman's eyes had not lingered on the petals, but had recoiled instead, as though they were accusatory. MissMarple had learned long ago that fear of a symbol often meant recognition, and recognition often meant guilt, if not of action, then perhaps of omission. And omissions, in her experience, were rarely innocent. That afternoon, with the drizzle fading to a fine mist, MissMarple took a walk. It was her habit in unfamiliar company to seek familiarity in surroundings, and the winding lanes of Little Witchford, though modest, had changed less than she had expected. She passed the greengrocer's shop, where Mrs. Parley still arranged her produce in pyramids, and Chapel Lane, where children no longer played marbles, as they once had. But it was the bishop's cottage that drew her attention, a solemn, ivy-draped structure at the edge of the green, unoccupied for many years, yet oddly untouched by decay. She paused at the low iron gate. The path beyond it was overgrown, but not impassable. The door bore the marks of weather and neglect, and yet the air around it felt recently disturbed. There was something too orderly in the disarray, an absence of cobwebs, where one might expect abundance. MissMarple did not linger. She knew that cottages, like people, could wear silence as a disguise, and that some silences were best observed before being questioned. As twilight approached, a quiet stir moved through the village. Mrs. Bartlett at the bakery had seen a stranger, a woman, tall and finely dressed, walking alone near the bishop's cottage. She had paused by the gate, as if considering entry, before vanishing into the growing dusk. By evening, the murmurs had begun in earnest. No one had rented the bishop's cottage in over a decade. Who was she? A relation of the bishop, perhaps? Or a London lady in search of countryside air? Miss Marple, upon hearing this over supper, said very little, but her mind drew a quiet line. From the envelope to the petals, from Edith's pale silence to the stranger's appearance. She had always believed that strangers rarely arrived in villages without purpose. And when they arrived unannounced, it was often the past, not the future, they were here to see. That night, the wind pressed gently against the cottage windows, rustling the hedges and stirring forgotten leaves. Miss Marple sat in her room, the envelope placed upon the side table beside a small lamp. The petals remained motionless, yet their presence seemed to echo something long buried. She considered the possibilities, too few for comfort. The past had stirred, and it had done so deliberately. The petals had meaning, and not merely poetic. They were a message sent, not merely found. But to whom were they addressed? And more urgently, why now? A strange woman near a forgotten cottage. A long-settled marriage showing subtle cracks. And a silence that lingered in Edith's expression, as though she were waiting for something she did not dare to name. Miss Marple, with her knitting untouched in her lap, allowed herself a single nod. The past had indeed returned to Little Witchford, and it had brought company. The arrival of Mademoiselle Celeste Vernier occasioned no grand announcement, no bustling carriage or flurry of suitcases. She appeared, rather, with quiet precision. Her reservation of the bishop's cottage had been made through an agency in Bath. Her letters, polite and understated. Her presence, altogether dignified. A woman of some 45 years, she carried herself with the poised gravity that often accompanies lives lived among art, silence, or sorrow. It was the second week of April when she settled in. The cottage had been unoccupied for years, yet Mademoiselle Vernier made no complaint of draughts or dust. She requested nothing beyond fresh milk and writing paper, and her accent, though unmistakably French, bore the soft, cultivated tones of one educated among English novels and Sunday etiquette. There was little enough to feed village curiosity, except, perhaps, that she had asked for no companion, had brought no maid, and seemed to welcome neither interruption nor company. Miss Marple, who had heard of the arrival from her cousin's milkman, remarked only that it was odd for someone to seek solitude in such a place, unless they were in search of something already lost. Within a matter of days, Celeste Vernier had made her presence known, gently, discreetly, and with a purpose. She introduced herself to the vicar with a brief note and a request. Might she be permitted to consult the parish records? She explained she was researching a volume on the evolution of English village customs, with particular interest in the patterns of land inheritance and familial migration. The explanation on the surface was entirely plausible, yet her line of inquiry soon narrowed, not on agricultural trends or folk songs, but on names. Old names. The Robothams in particular, a family once prominent in the district, though their manor had long since fallen into disrepair, and their lineage dissipated into memory. To some, the curiosity might have appeared academic, but those who spoke with her privately, Mrs. Parley at the shop, or old Mr. Chumley at the post, found her questions curiously pointed. Had Edwin Robotham been a cheerful man? Was it true he had drowned in the estate lake? And who had been in service there at the time? Miss Marple, when informed of these inquiries, only inclined her head. She knew too well that research was sometimes simply grief in disguise. On Thursday afternoon, Mademoiselle Vernier was invited to tea at the vicarage. The invitation had been extended by Edith Calthorpe with characteristic graciousness, though not without hesitation. Mildred had suggested it. It might be nice, she had said, to welcome her properly. Miss Marple attended as well, knitting in hand, though her needles barely moved. Celeste arrived precisely on time. Her navy coat was spotless, her gloves faintly perfumed with something floral, yet foreign. She accepted tea with a murmur of thanks and offered a remark on the garden view, a compliment that, as Miss Marple noted, was oddly tinged with familiarity. The conversation turned inevitably to village history. Celeste spoke with cultivated curiosity, asking about old households, changes in landscape, and garden traditions. When she inquired after the rose beds behind the vicarage, particularly the ones now removed. Edith's hand paused briefly on the teapot. They had canker, she said simply. We dug them out last spring. Celeste's expression remained mild, but her next question was more pointed. And were they planted before you came here, madam, or after? The room, for a moment, grew quieter. Miss Marple, glancing at the worn carpet and the fading floral wallpaper, was struck by the careful choreography beneath the civility. Throughout the tea, Miss Marple observed Mademoiselle Vernier with the kind of scrutiny one does not perform with the eyes, but with instinct and lived experience. The Frenchwoman was undeniably composed. Her diction was careful, her gestures restrained, but there was a tautness behind the serenity, as though her attentiveness served a precise and private purpose. She did not engage in idle chatter, nor did she indulge in the usual speculations about weather or recipes. Instead, her attentions were subtly, but consistently, drawn to Edith Calthorpe. Not in any overt or unkind way, but with the quiet focus of someone assembling a puzzle from fragments others had long discarded. She asked about the household staff, about the layout of the garden in earlier years, and, most tellingly, about the location of the rose beds in relation to the summer bench beneath the old oak. It was a detail few would know. Fewer still would ask. Miss Marple noted, too, that Celeste never once reached for sugar, though she had placed 2 cubes into her saucer at the start. She had been thinking of something else entirely, and in the silence that followed the departure, Edith seemed smaller, not physically, but in presence, as though something in her had retreated. By the following day, Edith's discomfort had become visible, even to those less attuned than Miss Marple. She spoke more softly, moved less purposefully, and had begun to misplace small items, a habit uncharacteristic for a woman whose housekeeping had always bordered on the meticulous. At the Thursday sewing circle, she confessed to a vague tiredness, blaming it on the weather's damp insistence, though the skies had been clear. When Celeste's name came up casually from Mrs. Parley, Edith's fingers fumbled with her embroidery floss. What Miss Marple noticed most, however, was the way Edith reacted when someone mentioned the Robotham estate in passing. The name, once merely distant in its resonance, now struck a chord too sharply to be ignored. Later that afternoon, the vicar remarked to Miss Marple that Edith had seemed oddly distracted. He wondered if she might be overexerting herself. Miss Marple, with a gentle smile, suggested perhaps Edith needed rest. What she did not say aloud, but thought very clearly, was that Edith's pallor had deepened at the mention of a bench. The bench beneath the oak. Edwin Robotham's bench, as it had once been known. The past, Miss Marple mused, did not often remain buried, especially when roses had once grown beside it. That evening passed without incident, or so it seemed. The vicar conducted a reading in the parish hall, and Edith retired early. But by morning, the household was stirred by a quiet alarm. Upon Edith's embroidered pillowcase, perfectly smooth, as always, there rested an envelope. Unlike the first, this one bore no postage mark. It had not come through the post. It had been placed deliberately, almost ceremonially. The cream paper was identical. Inside, again, were 4 dried rose petals, their edges curled inward, as though closing upon a secret. The vicar, distressed but cautious, suggested it might be an elaborate prank. Edith said nothing, only stared. Miss Marple requested, in her unobtrusive manner, to keep the envelope. She examined the fibers, the fold, the absence of glue. It had been slipped shut, not sealed. There were no smudges, only the faintest scent of lavender and ink. Someone had entered the house during the night, not to steal, but to leave, and not to harm, but to remind. As she stood in the hallway with the envelope in hand, Miss Marple considered the weight of messages not written. A letter of no words could still speak louder than memory. And somewhere in the village, someone was listening for an answer. It was while waiting for a half-pound of tea and a tin of ginger biscuits that Miss Marple, quite by chance, overheard the name she had not heard in years. The grocer's wife, Mrs. Simmons, who took pride in her discretion, but indulged freely when unobserved, was speaking in hushed tones to Mrs. Whittle, the doctor's sister. Before she married the vicar, Mrs. Simmons said, lowering her voice in theatrical sorrow, she was promised to Edwin Robotham, the younger one, the sensitive one. Drowned in that lake they had behind the estate. Poor boy, she never speaks of it. Mrs. Whittle shook her head, murmuring something about tragedy clinging to old names. 30 years ago this summer, she added, as if time had not softened the event. But such things don't fade for everyone. Miss Marple, gently folding her change into her purse, made no outward response, but the name stirred something at once distant and sharp. Edwin Robotham. The Petals. Edith's reaction. She left the grocer's with her parcel and a quietly deepening unease. Some stories refused to end neatly, and some folded themselves into the creases of village life, waiting patiently, until a stranger arrived to unfold them again. Edwin Robotham's death had long been recorded in local history as tragic but uncomplicated. The verdict of suicide had followed swiftly, aided by a farewell note of ambiguous tone and the persistent rumor of a broken engagement. At the time, few had wished to pry deeper. The Robothams were a family of old name and moderate fortune. Discretion, even in grief, had been their way. Yet the lake had never seemed still since. Children no longer played near its banks. The estate, long since sold and divided, carried an air of abandonment, as though it had exhaled its sorrow and closed its doors against memory. Miss Marple found herself recalling a detail from that summer, an overheard comment from a gardener, a whispered suspicion at the Women's Institute meeting. Edwin had been melancholy, yes, but not despondent. He had spoken of new beginnings, of leaving the village, and then he had drowned. No one had seen him go into the water. The note, though handwritten, had been uncharacteristically brief, and Edith, by then, had been absent. Sent away, some said, though no one could say who had done the sending. Miss Marple reflected, not for the first time, that suicides rarely wear neat labels, and lakes rarely forget. It was on a rain-polished afternoon that Miss Marple paid a visit to old Martha Finch, who now resided in a modest alms cottage near the church. Martha had once served at the Robotham estate, as parlour-maid, and later as housekeeper, before being pensioned off with quiet efficiency. Time had dimmed her hearing, but not her memory. When Miss Marple asked, with gentle phrasing, about the summer Edwin died, Martha's hands, busy with mending, paused for a long moment. They dismissed Miss Edith the very next morning, she said finally. Didn't tell her in front of anyone. Sent word through cook, I believe. Bags packed by noon. This detail, delivered without embellishment, had the ring of something long unsaid, but never forgotten. She was a lovely girl, proper and sweet. But something changed after Mr. Edwin came back from the city. There were talks, not arguments exactly, but the sort with long silences in between. Miss Marple inquired whether Edwin had spoken of leaving. He'd asked me just days before if I knew whether the railway ran straight to Dover from here. Miss Marple thanked her kindly, and as she stepped into the lane, her thoughts took firmer shape. An interrupted plan, a sudden dismissal, and a silence that had lasted 3 decades too long. If Celeste Verrier's earlier inquiries had been delicately framed in academic curiosity, they now grew more pointed. Her questions, when posed at the post office, at the bakery, or to Mrs. Parley behind the counter, revealed a singular focus. She wished to know Edwin's habits, his routines, the location of the summer bench beneath the oak, the books he had borrowed from the parish library. Miss Marple, hearing these reports, thought again of the second envelope. The Petals, for, once more, had not been casually chosen. There was intention in repetition, and where there is repetition, there is message. Celeste's questions reached even the legal past, asking delicately after the disposition of the Robotham estate. Was there a will? Did Edwin have property? Had he expected to inherit? The villagers, politely confused, could offer little beyond speculation. Most had not thought of Edwin in years. Miss Marple, however, began to consider that Celeste's interest lay not in Edwin's death, but in his preparations for life, plans unfulfilled, promises withheld. She was not writing a book, at least not the kind that lived on library shelves. By week's end, the threads Miss Marple had quietly gathered began to twist into something resembling a pattern. For Petals, 2 envelopes, one French woman with precise questions, one English woman growing paler by the day. It had not escaped Miss Marple's notice that the Petals had arrived before Edith's collapse in composure, nor had she overlooked the particular phrasing in Celeste's inquiries. Not, how did he die? But who did he trust? And to whom did he write? The symbolism of the Petals began to trouble her. For not a bouquet, not a blossom, but fragments, pieces from a whole. Miss Marple had long believed that those who intended harm seldom chose symbols, but those who sought justice, justice of a private and often painful nature, frequently did. She reviewed in her mind the likely recipients of Edwin's trust. Edith, certainly. His brother, perhaps. Lionel Foray, the vicar's old friend. And a fourth, perhaps someone forgotten, or perhaps not a person at all, but an act. The petals were not tokens of remembrance. They were a reckoning. Miss Marple, sitting beside her cousin's mantelpiece that evening, felt the warmth of the fire dim slightly. The past had returned, not with answers, but with questions made of silence and scent. It was old Martha Finch again who brought word the next morning, her breath shallow from haste, and her shawl damp from the early mist. She had passed the bishop's cottage the previous night. Habit, she said, from years of walking the same path home. And something had caught her eye. A flicker of orange through the window. Firelight, unmistakably. I thought it odd, she told Miss Marple, since she never lights it after supper. But it was not the fire itself that disturbed her. It was what she glimpsed within it. A white envelope, she whispered. Thick paper edged with wax. Red wax. It caught the flame in a way I'll not forget. Miss Marple listened without interruption. She knew what such paper suggested. Something of value. Something preserved. She walked later to the edge of the bishop's cottage path, and paused near the overgrown laurel hedge. The air still held the faint scent of burnt wax and something else, lavender and old smoke. If the envelope had contained a letter, then it was no longer meant to be read, which meant its truth had either already been told, or was now meant to remain buried. Miss Marple turned slowly toward the lane. The past had been offered to the fire, but not everything had turned to ash. The morning of the spring fete dawned clear, with bunting strung dutifully between lampposts and the scent of sponge cake hanging faintly in the air. Yet even as the villagers assembled with cheer, a quiet tension rippled through the vicarage. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 9, having promised to assist Mildred at the jam stall. But her plans were interrupted by Edith's pale-faced housemaid emerging onto the front step with an envelope in hand. She had found it on the vicar's study table, unmarked, unstamped, and most curiously, unspoken for. Miss Marple took it gently and noted immediately what others had not. The cream paper was once again of quality stock, but this time it bore a faint smudge at one corner, reddish, dry, and unmistakably organic. It was not sealing wax. It was something darker. Inside were 4 dried rose petals, their edges brown but still distinct in their symmetry. The scent was faint lavender again, but the symbolism had curdled. This was no longer a gesture of memory or mourning. It had transformed into something cold, deliberate. Miss Marple turned the envelope once more in her hands, and the sun caught the stain with troubling clarity. If this was a warning, it had arrived too late. Something had already shifted. Shortly after midday, amidst the bustle of fete-goers and the distant strains of a brass quartet, a cry came from the vicarage garden. Mrs. Grimble, the churchwarden's wife, had gone to fetch more chairs and stumbled upon a figure lying near the hedge of clipped boxwood and early spring roses. It was Edith. She lay beside an overturned teacup and a dropped glove, her head resting at an unnatural angle against the edge of a stone bench. Her eyes were closed, her complexion ashen. Yet, as Miss Marple was swiftly called to her side, a shallow breath stirred the scarf tied loosely at her throat. "She's alive," Miss Marple said softly, more to the wind than to the others, but heavily sedated. There was no sign of violence, no bruising or struggle. Yet something in the stillness was not peace. The saucer bore traces of a powdery residue, pale and clinging at the rim. Her hands, when lifted, bore faint creases from where they had gripped the arm of the bench. The rose bushes, once symbols of gentle memory, seemed now to lean in like mourners, too late to warn. And somewhere nearby, the envelope with the smudged corner lay unopened in the vicar's study drawer. Even as Edith was carried indoors, another discovery cast a deeper pall over the fate. Behind the church garden, past the hydrangeas and the overgrown path to the vestry tool shed, Lionel Foray was found, collapsed, lifeless, and still clutching one worn gardening glove. He had not arrived to the fete, nor answered his door that morning. It was assumed at first that he had taken ill. But the truth, when found by the curate's assistant, was of a graver order. His head bore a wound blunt precise, delivered with a force that had left no ambiguity. The tool shed's latch was broken. A pair of pruning shears lay nearby, untouched. No other tool was missing. MissMarple, summoned once again, stood in quiet contemplation. Foray, the vicar's old friend, had been involved in every parish matter of the last 2 decades. Quiet, dutiful, and fond of his roses. And yet something in his death felt neither random nor impulsive. She recalled Celeste's questions, particularly her interest in who had known Edwin best, and who had been close to Edith before her marriage. Foray had known both, and perhaps more than he had ever admitted. The fate continued in quiet confusion, but the air had turned sharp with fear. By afternoon, word had spread in fractured pieces: Edith's collapse, Foray's death, and the curious matter of the 3rd envelope. Whispers traveled with astonishing speed through the lanes and parlors of Little Witchford. The fate's laughter had dulled to a muted murmur, like a hymn sung without conviction. And yet, through it all, Mademoiselle Celeste Verrier remained silent. She was not seen among the stalls, nor in the crowd. Her cottage remained shuttered, her blinds drawn. The milk bottle left at her doorstep that morning remained untouched by dusk. To some, her absence passed as dignity and grief. To others, it suggested a darker motive, retreat rather than reverence. MissMarple, for her part, did not rush to conclusions. But she noted the change. The purposeful woman who had asked quiet questions, who had lingered over garden beds and names etched in memory, now seemed to recede. Withdrawn, not in sorrow, but in calculation. And it was not escape that worried MissMarple, it was completion. For those who vanish before the dust has settled often do so with the quiet confidence of those who believe. Their work is done. That evening, seated beside the vicar's hearth, with her knitting untouched in her lap, MissMarple allowed her mind to move between memory and deduction. The 1st envelope had seemed nostalgic, an echo of something unfinished. The 2nd, more intimate and pointed. But the 3rd, especially with its stain, was different. It bore the mark not of memory, but of retribution. MissMarple had long believed that symbolism, when repeated with precision, spoke not to whim, but to purpose. The rose petals, always 4. Never more. Never fewer. They were now no longer benign tokens of sentiment, they were verdicts. She considered who had received them. Edith, certainly. Perhaps Fawcett. And the rest? She could not yet be sure. But the shift was undeniable. The rose, once a symbol of beauty, of romantic grief, was now an emblem of justice, rendered privately, without the theater of courts or police. The kind of justice sought by those who believe the past has not merely lingered, but failed. MissMarple reached for her teacup, though she did not drink. The Petals had once spoken of remembrance. Now they murmured something else entirely. Judgment. The following morning, the vicar, wearied from vigil and uncertainty, confessed to MissMarple that something had been disturbed in his study. A drawer, normally locked and left undisturbed, had been forced open during the night. Its contents were humble enough: old sermons, baptismal records, notes from past parish meetings. But one item, he admitted, had been peculiar: a letter, not addressed to him, but kept by Edith for many years. A private item from her youth, folded into a brown envelope, marked with the initials ER. It had vanished. MissMarple, listening quietly, understood at once. Yar Edwin Robotham. The letter, it seemed, had been one of forgiveness, or perhaps proposal. Something meant for Edith, and for her alone. And now it was gone. She imagined Celeste, quiet and methodical, searching by night. Not for money, not for secrets to sell, but for confirmation, for evidence that the betrayal had not been Edith's alone. MissMarple rose gently and moved to the window. Outside, the roses stirred faintly in the wind. The letter, like Edwin himself, had disappeared into silence, but its absence, like a missing piece of china in a well-laid table, had left a space no one could ignore. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when MissMarple took the slow walk to Ashcombe House, the convalescent home on the outskirts of Little Witchford. There, in a room that smelled faintly of liniment and boiled cabbage, resided Mr. Hubert Fell, once the head gardener of the Robotham estate. Age had softened his spine and silenced much of his voice. but his eyes retained the clarity of someone who had witnessed things, never written down. Miss Marple had brought barley cakes and a tin of tobacco. Conversation, as always, with the very old, took its time. When she mentioned Edwin, Mr. Fell's fingers paused over the biscuit in his hand. "Bright lad," he murmured. "Like the roses. Not many do. Not really. Not the red climbers. Said they were too honest for secrets." He spoke of a particular bush, Lady Hillington. Golden-scented. Fragrant. Temperamental. She died the same week as Master Edwin. Turned black overnight. We called it blight, but I never believed that. The roots were healthy. There was a pause, then a glance that lingered longer than courtesy required. He left something behind. Not money, nor name. Just grief. That sort doesn't go quiet. Not really. Miss Marple tucked away the words gently, like petals pressed into a page that was not yet finished. As Mr. Fell's memory unfurled, Miss Marple drew carefully toward the detail she had come to confirm. Had Edwin spoken of departure? Had he, in the days before his death, made plans to leave? "He asked me once," said the gardener slowly. "What trains ran south on a Sunday?" "South to Dover." Miss Marple inclined her head. That route would have led to the coast, and from there, to the continent. France or further. He said he was done with the family's arrangements. Said he wanted a different life. One not buried in land deeds and debt. "I asked if the lady was willing," Mr. Fell continued. "He said she'd come as she could, but time was short." Then came a phrase that caused Miss Marple to still entirely. He gave something to the housemaid to post. A letter. Said it had to reach her by Friday. But I heard later the girl fell sick, and the letter never went. Miss Marple said nothing at the time, but her mind marked the date. If that letter was never delivered, then the silence Edith bore might not have been hers by choice. She left Mr. Fell with thanks and a wrapped handkerchief. Outside, the air felt colder, as though the garden itself mourned something never begun. Later that day, Miss Marple requested a visit to the bishop's cottage, under the pretext of returning a misplaced knitting pattern. Celeste received her politely, yet her movements seemed more rehearsed, her gaze less open than before. She apologized for the disarray, a lie, for the place was in precise order. Miss Marple's eyes traveled with discretion. The furnishings bore no personal touches, no family photographs or letters, but there were books, rows of them, neatly aligned on the mantel, volumes on English inheritance law, archival ledgers, a thin book on the heraldry of minor landed families. Upon a side table sat a single pressed flower under glass, a red rose, carefully mounted, and unmistakably faded at the edges. Celeste spoke little, and Miss Marple asked fewer questions than she might have. She made her departure with grace, offering a comment on the gathering chill in the wind. Celeste nodded, but her smile did not follow her gaze. Miss Marple, stepping outside, did not look back. She had seen what she needed to. A cottage not occupied, but prepared. Not lived in, but curated. Like a stage, readied for a performance that had already begun. The truth, when it arrived, came in fragments. An old parish register, a ledger of dismissals from the Robotham household, and in a folded letter once belonging to Mildred's late aunt, a name written in unfamiliar ink, but remembered nonetheless. Adele Verrier, governess, dismissed without reference in 1899. Miss Marple pieced it together with the patience of one who had observed human nature far longer than most observe the weather. The Robothams, for all their piety and public pride, had long been unyielding in private matters. It was known that Edwin's mother had taken to her bed early in life and remained there, and that a series of governesses had passed through the estate, most remembered only in half-formed stories. Adele Verrier had been French, young, and reportedly too clever by half. Her dismissal, Miss Marple concluded, had not come from incompetence, but from disgrace. And disgrace, in such households, often pointed to one particular kind of scandal, one quietly arranged, then swiftly erased. Celeste, then, was Edwin's half-sister, born of silence, raised in the margins of a family that would not claim her, and now she had returned, not as supplicant or guest, but as heir to a memory that had never been acknowledged. A memory with thorns, like the roses she carried. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the petals spread before her like relics on a cloth. She had preserved one from each envelope, not for sentiment, but for study. The edges were crisp, each cut cleanly, not plucked, but selected. She considered Edwin, a young man pressed between duty and affection, a would-be suitor, a dreamer, perhaps, but not a fool. He had confided in 4 people. This much she believed now, without doubt. Edith first, his intended, or nearly so, a woman who might have left with him, had the letter reached her. Fawcett second, the vicar's friend, a man who had always been around, always helpful, always convenient. His brother third, long gone now, but known for his loyalty to the family name and its preservation. And a fourth, one not yet named, perhaps a servant, the housemaid who fell ill, or someone else entirely. But it was not the identities that lingered. It was the intent. The Petals were not nostalgic. They were accusatory. 4 for 4. For confidants. 4 judges. Or 4 suspects. One, perhaps, had betrayed him. And Celeste, it seemed, had come not to ask who, but to answer for him. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the hearth, where only embers remained. Tomorrow, she thought, something would give way. The Petals had nearly spoken. All that remained was their echo. The next morning, well before the milkman made his round, her scream shattered the stillness of the vicarage. It was Edith. The household gathered swiftly. The vicar stumbled from his study. The maid clutched a shawl to her chest, and Miss Marple, already half-dressed, moved with unsettling calm toward the source. Edith was seated upright in bed, trembling, her face the color of paper. Her hands gripped a blanket as if afraid it might vanish. She spoke only once before lapsing into a stunned silence. "He whispered my name," she said. "He whispered it. Edwin." There had been no sign of intrusion, no broken latch, no open window. And yet, on her pillow, beside her Bible, lay a single rose petal. Fresh this time. Crimson. Whole. The police were called, and searches began. But Celeste was gone. Her cottage stood undisturbed, but vacant. No note. No trace. No sign of farewell. The rose under glass remained. The books remained. But the woman, she had vanished. Miss Marple, standing in the doorway, did not call it flight, nor did she call it guilt. She called it conclusion. Some visit the past for answers. Others visit to deliver them. And some come not to mourn the dead, but to remind the living. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage garden with no intention of admiring spring's emergence. The roses had not yet bloomed. The earth was hesitant. Beneath the clipped hedges and dormant flower beds, something quieter lingered, something not yet named, but nearly spoken. She walked without gloves, though the morning chill had not lifted. Her steps were measured, unhurried, her eyes less on the paths than on the ground beside them. The rose bed, long disused and recently disturbed by Edith's collapse, drew her gaze. It was not the flowers that held her, but the shape of the soil. Tilled, yet subtly uneven. The footprints had faded, but their pattern remained. One set, deliberate, returning to the path as though nothing had happened. Miss Marple knelt, her hands tracing the edge of the rose bush's hollow. Her fingers found something metal, half-buried, a sliver of rusted iron. It yielded with little resistance, crumbling softly in her hand. She did not speak aloud, but her thoughts moved quickly. In gardens, things are buried not only for growth, and the ground remembers what the heart denies. The object unearthed was unmistakably a key, its teeth worn smooth, the bow ornate in a once delicate flourish, now dulled by rust and time. Miss Marple turned it gently between her fingers and considered its possible match. Later that morning, once Edith had fallen back into uneasy sleep, and the vicar was summoned to a call at the chapel, Miss Marple moved to the study with a discretion born of long practice. She had noted days earlier the forced drawer, the one the vicar claimed had held Edith's letter from Edwin. Now she tried the key. It slid in without resistance, as though time itself had merely been waiting. The drawer opened fully. There was no letter, of course. Not anymore. But the inner lining bore marks, a square outline, discolored slightly, where something had rested for years. The kind of outline a folded envelope might leave after being undisturbed for decades. She closed the drawer and replaced the key in her pocket. Not everything lost is taken. Some things are simply moved, hidden, or quietly burned. But the truth, once planted, has a way of returning, like a rose left dormant in winter soil. In the drawing room later that day, with the soft tick of the mantel clock marking each minute, Miss Marple allowed the final pattern to reveal itself. She thought of Edwin's letter, never received. A letter of forgiveness, perhaps, or invitation. And Edith, so often judged by omission, had known nothing. Her father, proud and particular, might easily have intercepted the post. One need not slander the dead to understand their habits. And in families such as the Calthorpes, appearance was often guarded more fiercely than affection. Edwin's hope to leave, to begin anew, had been silenced not by rejection, but by absence. The silence Edith bore was never her own choosing. Miss Marple reflected on Edith's years at the vicarage, her gentle presence, her subdued cheer, her precise avoidance of certain topics, all the small signs of a woman who lived not in guilt, but in confusion. Her grief, never properly addressed, because its origin had been obscured. It was not uncommon, and it was deeply cruel. Miss Marple folded her hands, her expression unreadable, and watched the fire's glow deepen. A love letter, undelivered, had done more harm than a cruel word ever could, and now the dead, it seemed, had demanded it be answered at last. By evening, the significance of the petals had crystallized in Miss Marple's mind, not as a riddle, but as a structure. 4 petals, 4 names, 4 confidences. Edwin had confided in his brother, who had remained loyal to the family legacy and had likely dissuaded him, or worse, informed the patriarch. Fawcett, too, had known something. Miss Marple believed he had been shown the letter, or perhaps even entrusted to deliver it. His reticence around Edith, his deference, these were not the marks of mere loyalty, but of conscience. Edith, the intended, had known nothing. Her guilt, if any, lay not in betrayal, but in the silence she had been forced to inhabit. And the 4th, perhaps the housemaid, perhaps another, possibly the one who had failed to post the letter, not out of malice, but misfortune. Or perhaps it had been Celeste herself, told at the edge of confidence, a sister unacknowledged but trusted. The petals then were not gestures of affection, nor accusation. They were tallies, markers, and Miss Marple now believed that Celeste had chosen each recipient not to punish, but to weigh, to see whether grief had grown into remorse, or simply taken root in denial. The inspector, a man of brisk efficiency and a preference for visible facts, received Miss Marple's quiet explanation with furrowed brow and restrained skepticism. She spoke without drama, presenting not accusation but inference, each point offered as observation rather than verdict. Celeste Verrier, she explained, had not acted in malice, but in mourning. Her presence had stirred no scandal, until the 3rd envelope, until the balance tipped from remembrance into reckoning. Fawcett's death, she suspected, had been the result of confrontation, not planning. An argument turned violent, perhaps not even intended as fatal. A question asked too forcefully, a silence misinterpreted as guilt. The inspector listened. He asked no unnecessary questions. And when Miss Marple finished, he merely nodded, slow and deliberate. There would be no manhunt, no charges. Celeste had vanished, leaving nothing behind but a pressed rose, and a silence that spoke volumes. Miss Marple approved, not because she condoned it, but because she understood it. Justice, she knew, was not always a matter of courtrooms and verdicts. Sometimes it wore the face of a grieving sister. Sometimes it delivered roses. And sometimes it vanished before sunrise. The final envelope came not with the post, nor by hand. It was found quietly, and without fuss, beneath Miss Marple's window pane the following morning. There was no name upon it, no address, no seal. Inside there were no petals, no fragments of red or hints of decay. Only a single sprig, green, fresh, unmistakable, rosemary for remembrance. Miss Marple held it gently, brushing her thumb along its fragrant leaves. The message was neither threat nor plea. It was a benediction. She placed it in a thin glass vase near the sill and stood for a long moment in thought. Rosemary for the dead, for the unloved, for the forgotten, for Edwin, for his mother, for Celeste. Some stories, she reflected, are not meant to be solved, but understood. Not every question demands an answer. Not every answer belongs to the living. She poured her tea and watched the garden stir in the breeze. One of the rose bushes, once thought withered, now bore a single bud, pale at the tip, quiet, stubborn. The world moved on, but not unchanged. MissMarple smiled faintly. Not every memory fades. Some remain, like petals between pages, or like rosemary, pressed gently between truth and mercy. The drawing room was quiet, as drawing rooms often are, when something has happened, but has not yet been spoken of aloud. The curtains let in a soft and uncertain light, and the ticking of the clock near the hearth carried a rhythm that might have been mistaken for calm. MissMarple sat in the chair nearest the mantel, a modest china cup resting in her hand, steam rising slowly from the rim. The vicar stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back. Edith sat with her eyes lowered, her folded handkerchief pressed between gloved fingers. Mrs. Grimble and the curate, present out of concern rather than authority, remained silent. The inspector, punctual and expressionless, waited without impatience. MissMarple began gently. She spoke not as one accusing, but as one who had simply followed a thread others had let go slack. Her tone, quiet and unyielding, moved from the envelope to the petals, from Celeste's questions to the faded marks in the drawer. The details were small gardens, benches, the rust of an old key, but each carried weight. No one interrupted her. Each word seemed to echo something someone in the room had known, but had chosen not to say. When she finished, no one stirred. The truth, once spoken, tends to settle like dust, and often lands where it hurts. MissMarple's voice did not rise, nor did it falter, as she laid out the truth of Celeste Vernier's identity. A daughter born of disgrace, exiled from memory, but never from blood, the child of a dismissed governess, and a man too proud to acknowledge her existence. A half-sister to Edwin Rowbottom by lineage, but to no one by name. She came not for justice, as the world understands it, MissMarple explained. She came for balance, for the weight of remembrance to be shared among those who had, whether through action or omission, allowed a life to end in solitude. The petals, then, were not threats, but emblems, each one pressed and dried with care. A private language of mourning, a silent accusation, a message sent to those who had either betrayed, or simply failed, to Edith for her absence, to Fawcett for his silence, to Edwin's brother, long since gone, and perhaps to herself, as the one left with the burden of memory. She had not poisoned, not stalked, not struck with intent to kill, but she had stirred the past, knowing it would no longer lie still, and in doing so, she had delivered a judgment of her own making, one wrapped in petals and sealed not with malice, but sorrow. MissMarple then addressed the letter, its place not merely in the vicar's study, but in the shadowed intersection of lives now unraveled. She spoke with care, yet with certainty, as she recounted how Edwin had written to Edith days before his death. A letter not of farewell, but of hope. He had asked her to leave with him, to begin anew, far from the expectations that had crushed them both. But the letter had never reached her. It had instead found its way into the hands of Lionel Fawcett, not by accident, but by design. Fawcett, the ever-present friend, had long stood close to both Edith and the Rowbottom family. Trusted, invisible, convenient. It was he who had chosen not to deliver the letter, who, upon reading Edwin's words, passed them to the Rowbottom patriarch, a man for whom scandal was a greater sin than sorrow. The patriarch had silenced the plea, and ensured Edith never knew. Why Fawcett had done it, whether from loyalty, fear, or some misguided protection, remained known only to him. But the result was the same. A promise extinguished, a future undone. Edith's confusion, her long silence, now took on a different shape. She had not rejected Edwin. She had never been given the chance to choose. And that, MissMarple observed quietly, is the most unforgivable omission of all. MissMarple turned her thoughts, and the room's attention, to the final matter, Fawcett's death. She paused before she spoke, not out of uncertainty, but out of regard. There is a difference between guilt and responsibility, and it is a difference that must be maintained. It had not been murder, she said. Not as such. It had been confrontation. A meeting that turned, in its heat and sorrow, to a struggle. Celeste had come not to kill, but to hear him admit what he had done, to extract a truth too long buried. But Fawcett, confronted not just with words, but with what he had caused. Edwin's life, Edith's love, could not bear it. His fall had not been carefully planned, but sudden, defensive, possibly panicked. The headwound spoke of a single blow, and not a calculated one. There were no signs of further violence, no theft, no message left behind. Celeste had fled, not in triumph, but in grief. She had not expected the final turn. She had come to speak for her brother. But the confrontation, so long delayed, had turned to tragedy once more. Miss Marple said nothing of forgiveness. She offered only understanding. Some deaths come from hatred, others from the tangled grief of too many years spent in silence. Fawcett's death, she believed, belonged to the latter. It was in the garden, Miss Marple explained, that the final act of remembrance had taken place. Edith's collapse had not been random. It had been designed to evoke something, a reenactment, however gentle, of Edwin's last hours. Celeste had placed the envelope near the bench, not to frighten, but to bring Edith to the place where memory and truth converged. The sedative, taken from Edith's own medicine cabinet, had been administered without malice, a dose sufficient only to still, not to end. Miss Marple believed it had been a message, not vengeance, but reflection, a mirror held to the past, urging the living to see what the dead could no longer say. The roses, too, played their part. It was beneath the oak, by the now dead rose bush, that Edwin had sat on his final day. It was there he had waited, letter undelivered, heart uncertain. Edith's collapse in that very place had not been chance. It had been orchestrated, to recall what had once been. And as Miss Marple noted gently, Edith had not screamed when she awoke. She had wept, not in fear, but in recognition. Some gardens are planted in beauty, others in memory, and some, like this one, are tended with grief. There was a long silence after Miss Marple's final words. The clock had struck the hour without notice, and the room remained suspended in the quiet aftermath of truths spoken plainly. The vicar stepped forward at last. He placed a hand upon Edith's shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was low and without ceremony. "We forgive what we understand," he said, "and what we did not understand, we must now learn to live with." Edith, who had kept her composure throughout, finally allowed the handkerchief to fall. Her tears were soft and restrained, but they carried the weight of 30 years. She had not been given the choice, and yet she had lived as though she had made it. Miss Marple made no attempt to console. She merely rose, walked to the window, and looked out toward the garden. Later that week, a new rose bush was planted in the same soil where the old had withered, not to replace it, but to mark what had passed. The vicar did himself, his hands unaccustomed to such work, but steady nonetheless. Edith stood beside him, the final petal resting in her palm, until it, too, was given to the earth. Peace, when it comes, does not erase. It settles, like roots, like silence after storm. Miss Marple watched from a distance and nodded once. The past had spoken, and the present at last had listened. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden with her tea, the cup resting lightly in her hand, as though it might float away should she loosen her grip. The day was temperate, the air neither still nor hurried, and the breeze moved gently through the hedge behind her. It stirred the edges of her shawl and passed over the late blooms with a kind of reverence, as though it, too, knew that something had passed, and something else had settled in its place. The garden bore little evidence of what had unfolded there in recent days. The soil had been raked, the bench cleaned, the newly planted rose bush stood quietly beside its older neighbors. Only the memory remained, tucked between petals, glances, silences. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the path that led toward the house. She could hear Edith's voice faintly from within, lighter now, though still brittle at its edges. The vicar's footsteps were soft and deliberate, not in mourning, but in rebalancing. She took a sip of her tea. It was slightly overbrewed, but she did not mind. There are moments, after all, when imperfections comfort us more than perfection ever could, and in that stillness, the garden held its peace. There is a kind of memory that does not fade, even when the particulars are lost. Miss Marple thought of this as she traced the rim of her cup with her thumb, her thoughts drifting back to a poem she had once read, something about petals pressed between pages, their colors faded, but their shape intact. Time, she reflected, does not erase sorrow. It simply thins it, like tea cooled in the pot. One forgets the words that were spoken, the precise angle of sunlight on a given afternoon, but one remembers the absence that followed. The seat left empty. The bench left unwaited upon. She had known women like Celeste before. Women born outside the lines, carrying legacies not recorded in registers. Their grief was different, private, and precise, and often they left no monuments but silence. The rose petals, she thought, had not been a threat. They had been a message, written in a language most would overlook, unless they had lived long enough to understand its grammar. She folded the thought gently into her mind, as one folds a letter no longer needed to be read aloud. Celeste had not come for spectacle. That much Miss Marple now believed with certainty. There had been no desire for exposure, no hunger for fame. Her justice had worn soft shoes and walked without disturbing the dust. In another life, she might have taken her pain to the press or the courts, or demanded public recognition of what had been lost and buried. But that was not her way. She had chosen the garden over the gavel, silence over scandal, a sister's justice, the kind that blooms quietly in the shadow of another's name. Miss Marple admired her in a quiet and cautious way, not for her methods, but for her restraint. It would have been so easy, so very human, to lash out, to destroy. Instead, she had delivered her message with roses and memory. She had whispered truth into ears that had stopped listening long ago. There would be no headlines, no tribunal, only the private knowledge among a few that the past had knocked on the door and had been received, if not welcomed. Such acts do not make the news, but they settle something, like dust after a storm, like a petal that lands on still water and is absorbed without ripple. Miss Marple had long understood that not all crimes are written into statute. Some live in the pauses between laws, in the silences no courtroom can convict. A letter not delivered, a daughter never named, a silence forced upon a woman for the sake of family pride. These were not offenses one could prosecute, but they wounded all the same. The law concerns itself with actions, but Miss Marple had always known, the heart is rarely governed by action alone. Motives bloom and wither in the space between intent and result, and in that space, justice is often elusive. Celeste's actions had skirted the formalities of guilt. She had not struck first, nor with design, but her presence had stirred truths others had buried too deeply for safety. She had held a mirror to the past, and in doing so, had asked only that it be looked at clearly, honestly. Miss Marple did not pretend to condone all that had happened, but neither could she dismiss the weight that had brought Celeste here. She had come for truth, not triumph. And in this quiet English garden, far from war and noise, that truth had at last found soil. Just before rising to leave, Miss Marple's eyes returned to the new rose bush. It had taken root quietly, without fuss, and for days had shown nothing more than leaves, green, tentative, unremarkable. But now, in the hour between tea and dusk, a single bud had opened. It was not large, nor particularly vibrant. A modest red, leaning slightly to one side, as if uncertain of its welcome. And yet it stood alone. Firm. Complete. Sufficient. Miss Marple watched it for a moment, the corners of her mouth lifting, not quite into a smile. It had waited, chosen its moment. No gardener had coaxed it. No command had summoned it. But it had bloomed, as some truths do. Not when demanded, but when the earth is ready to receive them. She rose with care, leaving her cup beside the empty chair. As she walked toward the path, she paused and looked once more at the rose. Her story had been told, not shouted, not published, but lived. A wound had been reopened, and in doing so, had begun to close differently. And there, in the stillness of the garden, something had dared to bloom again. Even silence, she thought, can blossom when given time. And so, in the quiet hush of a garden where once secrets were buried, the truth found its way to the surface. Not in thunder or spectacle, but in petals and whispers, remembered glances, and one final sprig of rosemary beneath the window pane. Justice, when it came, was not about punishment but understanding. For what Celeste sought was not vengeance, but a voice, for the silences her brother died within. And in uncovering the past, Miss Marple reminded us all that sometimes healing comes not through courts or headlines, but through knowing and honoring the pain that time tried to erase. But that leaves us with a lingering thought. If you had found Edwin Robatham's final letter before anyone else, would you have delivered it to Edith? Or kept it hidden? Would it have saved a life? Or changed the course of another?